Beneath the largest desert on Earth there are tree roots, not small roots, not the kind you'd find in your backyard. These roots are petrified in perfect circles, and each one is wider than a football stadium. Some stretch over 600 feet across. They're not scattered randomly. They form patterns, geometric patterns that cover thousands of square miles. And here's what makes this absolutely mind-bending. These roots are proof that the Sahara Desert, all 3.6 million square miles of it, was once a rainforest so dense that individual trees had root systems the size of modern cities. But that's not the story you were taught. You were told the Sahara has always been a desert, that it's been dry for millions of years, that human civilization emerged in the Fertile Crescent because everywhere else was uninhabitable wasteland. However, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and core samples from the Sahara tell a completely different story, one that rewrites the economic history of early human civilization. If you're interested in how hidden landscapes rewrite what we know about ancient economics and human development, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed historical evidence every week. Now let's dig into what's really buried under the Sahara. The first hint came in 1982. A French geological survey team was mapping underground water sources in southern Algeria when their ground-penetrating radar detected something impossible. Massive circular structures buried under 40 feet of sand. At first, they thought it was a data error. Radar glitches were common in the Sahara because of the mineral composition. But when they repositioned the equipment and ran the scan again, the circles were still there. Hundreds of them, all perfectly round, all roughly the same depth. The team marked the coordinates and moved on, noting the anomaly in their report but not pursuing it further. Their job was water, not archaeology. For almost a decade, those coordinates sat in a filing cabinet at the French National Centre for Scientific Research. Nobody followed up. The survey had been classified as routine, and the circular anomalies were written off as geological formations, probably ancient sinkholes or collapsed lava tubes. It wasn't until 1991 that a graduate student named Mathieu Schuster stumbled across the report while researching Saharan aquifer systems. Schuster wasn't looking for buried forests. He was trying to map water tables, but something about those perfect circles bothered him. Sinkholes don't form in geometric patterns. Lava tubes don't create uniform circumferences. Schuster convinced his advisor to fund a follow-up expedition, and in the summer of 1992, they returned to the coordinates with updated radar equipment and a small drilling rig. What they pulled up from 40 feet below the surface changed everything. It was wood, petrified wood, but not just a fragment or a fossilized branch. They had drilled directly into a root system so massive that the core sample didn't reach the outer edge. The root was still continuing horizontally underground. Schuster's team spent 3 weeks at that site, taking samples every 50 feet in a radial pattern. Every single drill hit petrified wood. They were standing on top of a tree root that measured over 520 feet in diameter. When they finally calculated the size of the tree that would have needed a root system that large, the numbers didn't make sense. A root ball 520 feet wide would require a trunk at least 80 feet in diameter and a canopy spread of nearly 1,000 feet. That's not a tree. That's a small ecosystem. But here's where it gets stranger. When Schuster's team analyzed the growth rings in the petrified wood, they found something that contradicted every established timeline for Saharan climate history. The rings showed consistent rapid growth. No drought years, no stress markers. This tree had grown in an environment with abundant rainfall and stable temperatures for at least 800 consecutive years. And the carbon dating put the tree's death at approximately 4,500 years ago. Not millions of years, not hundreds of thousands, 4,500 years. That's well within recorded human history. That's roughly the same time period as the construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the rise of the Akkadian Empire, and the earliest Sumerian city-states. According to every history textbook, the Sahara was already a desert by then. Human civilizations were clustered around rivers like the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates because everywhere else was too dry to support agriculture. But if the Sahara was a rainforest just 4,500 years ago, that entire narrative collapses. Schuster published his findings in 1994. The paper was peer-reviewed, the data was verified, and the academic response was immediate and brutal. Geologists attacked the carbon dating methodology. Climatologists dismissed the findings as contaminated samples. Archaeologists argued that there was no cultural evidence of human habitation in the Sahara during that period, so the tree must be an outlier or the dates must be wrong. Schuster's funding was quietly cut. His follow-up proposals were rejected, and within 2 years he had moved on to other research. The petrified roots under the Sahara were filed away again, this time with a note that the findings were inconclusive and required further study. Further study that never came. But Schuster wasn't the last person to find them. Between 1995 and 2003, at least 4 other geological teams working independently in different regions of the Sahara reported similar discoveries. Circular root systems, petrified wood, carbon dates clustering between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. Each time the findings were published in specialized journals, acknowledged briefly, and then ignored. No major university launched a comprehensive study. No government funded a large-scale excavation. The discoveries were treated as curiosities, interesting footnotes, not paradigm-shifting evidence. In 2009, everything changed. NASA released high-resolution satellite imagery of the Sahara taken by the Landsat 7 satellite. The images were part of a global mapping project tracking desertification and climate change. Researchers were looking for patterns of sand movement, shifts in dune formations, and changes in vegetation at the desert's edges. What they found instead were the circles, thousands of them, visible from space, faint outlines in the sand where the ground had settled differently over the buried root systems. The circles weren't random, they formed clusters. In some areas, dozens of circles overlapped, creating interconnected patterns that looked almost architectural. And when researchers cross-referenced the satellite data with the locations of previous ground discoveries, every single circle matched a known petrified root system. The full scale became clear when a team from the University of Arizona used the satellite data to create a distribution map. They identified over 3,200 distinct circular formations across the Sahara, concentrated primarily in 3 regions: southern Algeria, northern Chad, and western Libya. Each circle ranged between 400 and 700 feet in diameter. If you calculate the spacing between them and account for overlap, you're looking at a forest canopy that would have covered nearly 1.2 million square miles. That's an area larger than the entire Amazon rainforest. And it existed in what is now the most inhospitable desert on the planet. Here's the part that breaks the official timeline. If the Sahara was forested 4,500 years ago, then the transition from rainforest to desert didn't happen gradually over tens of thousands of years. It happened in a single human lifespan, maybe 2. Climate models show that a shift that dramatic would require a catastrophic trigger, not slow desertification, not natural climate cycles, something sudden, something that removed the rainfall, killed the trees, and turned 3.6 million square miles of forest into sand in less than a century. And if that event happened during recorded history, there should be evidence, written records, oral traditions, archaeological markers. So, where are they? The Egyptians have records going back to 3100 BCE. They documented floods, droughts, plagues, famines, wars, and celestial events. But nowhere in Egyptian records is there any mention of a climate apocalypse to the west. No references to forest dying, no mass migrations from the Sahara, no stories of rivers drying up or green land turning to sand. The Egyptians treated the western desert as if it had always been there. But if the petrified roots are telling the truth, the Sahara rainforest was dying at the exact same time the Egyptians were building their first pyramids. How did they not notice? Unless they did notice, and the records were lost, or suppressed, or rewritten. Because if the Sahara was habitable and resource-rich during the rise of early civilizations, then the entire economic map of the ancient world was different. The Fertile Crescent wasn't the only option. The Nile wasn't the only lifeline. And the concentration of power in Mesopotamia and Egypt wasn't inevitable. It was the result of catastrophic environmental collapse elsewhere. The size of the root systems tells us something important about the trees themselves. Modern rainforest trees rarely exceed 200 feet in height and 15 feet in trunk diameter. The largest living tree by volume is a giant sequoia in California, with a trunk diameter of about 30 feet. But the root balls under the Sahara suggest trees with trunks between 60 and 100 feet in diameter. That's not just big, that's outside the known range of any species currently alive, which means either these were a species that went extinct, or they were a known species growing under conditions so ideal that they reached sizes we've never seen before. Core samples from multiple sites show growth rings consistent with tropical hardwoods, dense wood, slow decay, high resistance to insect damage. These weren't softwood conifers, they were broad-leafed giants, the kind of trees that create thick canopy cover and support complex ecosystems underneath. If you've ever walked through an old-growth rainforest, you know what that looks like. The ground is shaded, the air is humid, the temperature is stable, and everywhere you look, there's life. Birds, insects, mammals, fungi, vines, ferns. A single large tree can support hundreds of species. Now multiply that by millions of trees across an area the size of India. That's not a forest, that's a biological engine. And it wasn't just trees. Pollen analysis from soil samples taken near the root system shows a staggering diversity of plant life. Ferns, grasses, flowering plants, medicinal herbs. The soil chemistry indicates high organic content, which means active decomposition, leaf litter, rotting wood, fungal networks breaking down dead material and recycling nutrients. This was a fully functioning rainforest ecosystem. Not a marginal environment, not a transitional zone, a thriving, stable, resource-rich landscape, which raises an economic question. If the Sahara was this fertile 4,500 years ago, why isn't there evidence of human habitation? Where are the cities, the farms, the trade routes, the irrigation systems? If early humans were already farming in the Fertile Crescent, building cities in Sumer, and developing writing in Egypt, why would they ignore a forest the size of the Amazon right next door? The standard answer is that they didn't ignore it because it didn't exist. But the petrified roots say otherwise. So either humans were there and we haven't found the evidence yet, or something prevented them from exploiting the region. Something big enough to keep them out. To understand what killed the Saharan rainforest, you have to understand what kept it alive. Rainforests require three things: consistent rainfall, warm temperatures, and stable atmospheric moisture. The Sahara sits between 15 and 35 degrees north latitude, which today is a high-pressure zone where dry air descends and suppresses cloud formation. But 6,000 years ago, Earth's axial tilt was slightly different. The North African monsoon reached farther north, pulling moisture from the Atlantic Ocean and dumping it across the Sahara. Lake Chad, which today is a shallow remnant, was once a body of water the size of the Caspian Sea. Rivers flowed, wetlands stretched for hundreds of miles, and the forest thrived. But around 5,500 years ago, the monsoons started to shift. Earth's axial tilt changed by a fraction of a degree, just enough to weaken the monsoon's northern reach. Rainfall declined, rivers shrank, lakes began to evaporate, and the forest started to die. Climate models suggest this transition took between 500 and 1,000 years, a relatively rapid shift, but still slow enough that ecosystems could adapt. Some species would migrate, others would evolve, the forest might shrink, but it wouldn't disappear entirely. Except that's not what happened. The forest didn't shrink, it collapsed, completely, within a time frame that suggests a tipping point was crossed. Here's the mechanism. Rainforests create their own rainfall. The trees pull water from the soil, release it through their leaves, and create localized humidity that feeds back into the atmosphere. This process, called transpiration, can generate up to 50% of a rainforest's total rainfall. It's a self-sustaining cycle. But if you remove enough trees, the cycle breaks, transpiration decreases, humidity drops, rainfall declines, and the remaining trees start to die from drought, which reduces transpiration even more. It's a feedback loop, and once it starts, it accelerates. So here's what likely happened. The North African monsoon weakened, reducing external rainfall. The forest, which had relied on both monsoon rains and its own transpiration, started to lose trees at the edges. As the edges died, the interior forest lost its moisture buffer. Transpiration declined, localized rainfall dropped, more trees died, the feedback loop intensified, and within a few generations the entire system collapsed. The trees died, the soil dried out, the wind picked up the exposed topsoil and turned it into sand, and the Sahara as we know it today was born. But there's a complication. Feedback loops don't kill forests uniformly, they create pockets of survival, microclimates where conditions remain stable enough for ecosystems to persist. We see this in modern deforestation. Even in heavily logged areas, patches of old-growth forest survive in valleys near rivers or on mountain slopes where moisture lingers. But in the Sahara, there are no pockets, no surviving forests, no isolated groves clinging to life in sheltered valleys. The forest was erased completely, which suggests the collapse wasn't just ecological, it was catastrophic. Something beyond a slow feedback loop, something that removed the forest so quickly and so thoroughly that nothing survived. One hypothesis involves fire. If the forest dried out quickly enough, it would become fuel. A single lightning strike could ignite a fire that burned for months, consuming millions of acres. Ancient charcoal deposits have been found in Saharan soil, suggesting large-scale burning. But fire alone doesn't explain the totality of the collapse. Forests recover from fire, they regrow, unless the conditions that supported them no longer exist. Which brings us back to the rainfall. If the monsoon weakened faster than models predict, if there was a sudden atmospheric shift that cut off moisture entirely, the forest wouldn't just die. It would desiccate, and desiccated forests don't regrow, they turn to dust. If the Sahara was a rainforest during the early Bronze Age, the economic geography of human civilization was radically different than we've been taught. The standard narrative says that agriculture emerged in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE because it was the only place with reliable water and arable land. Societies formed around rivers, trade routes followed waterways, power concentrated in regions where irrigation was possible. Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley. These became the centers of civilization because everywhere else was too dry, too cold, or too dangerous. But if the Sahara was fertile, that logic falls apart. A rainforest the size of the Sahara would have supported millions of people. Hunting, gathering, early agriculture. The forest would have provided timber, game, medicinal plants, and fresh water. It would have been a resource base larger than anything in Mesopotamia or Egypt. And yet, we have no record of cities, no evidence of large-scale agriculture, no trade networks, nothing. Which means either humans avoided the region, or the evidence was buried under 40 feet of sand when the forest collapsed. There's a third option. What if humans were there, but their economic model was so different from the agrarian city-states we recognize that we don't know what to look for? Rainforest societies don't build cities. They don't need them. Resources are abundant and distributed. Population density stays low because the environment provides without concentration. There's no need for granaries, irrigation systems, or defensive walls. Communities stay mobile. They leave minimal archaeological footprints, and when the forest dies, everything they built disappears with it. This model fits what we know about pre-agricultural societies. Hunter-gatherers were highly successful, not primitive. They had complex knowledge systems, sophisticated tool use, and extensive trade networks. They didn't build pyramids because they didn't need to. Their wealth was in knowledge, mobility, and access to diverse resources. A rainforest society in the Sahara would have been invisible to archaeology because it didn't produce the markers we associate with civilization. No pottery, no fortifications, no temples, just people living in balance with an ecosystem that provided everything they needed. And then that ecosystem died. The monsoon shifted, the trees collapsed, the rivers dried up, and the people who had lived there for thousands of years were forced to migrate. They moved east toward the Nile, they moved south into sub-Saharan Africa, they moved north toward the Mediterranean. And when they arrived, they brought knowledge with them. Knowledge of plants, animals, weather patterns, and survival strategies learned in one of the richest environments on Earth. Knowledge that would have made them invaluable to the agrarian societies they joined. But because they came as refugees, not conquerors, their origins were forgotten. The Saharan rainforest became a myth, and eventually it was erased from history entirely. This explains a persistent mystery in Egyptology. Around 3100 BCE, Egyptian civilization underwent a rapid advancement. Writing appeared, Monumental architecture began. Complex irrigation systems were developed. The standard explanation is that this was a natural evolution of local agricultural societies. But there's no gradual build-up. It happens suddenly, almost as if an influx of new people brought new ideas, people who knew how to manage large-scale resources, people who understood ecological balance, people who had lived in an environment where survival required deep knowledge of complex systems, people from the Sahara. So why isn't this common knowledge? Why aren't the petrified roots under the Sahara taught in every history class? Why hasn't there been a massive international research effort to excavate, map, and study the evidence? The answer is simpler than you'd think. It contradicts too many established narratives. Academic disciplines are built on frameworks. Those frameworks determine what gets funded, what gets published, and what gets taught. When evidence emerges that challenges a framework, it's not welcomed. It's resisted, not because of conspiracy, because of inertia. The framework for early human history says civilization began in river valleys because only river valleys had the resources to support agriculture. The Sahara is a desert. Deserts don't support agriculture. Therefore, the Sahara was never a center of civilization. Any evidence suggesting otherwise must be flawed, misinterpreted, or irrelevant. This is how academic gatekeeping works, not through malice, through the enforcement of consensus. If your findings don't fit the consensus, they're ignored, not because they're wrong, because they're inconvenient. Mathieu Schuster's research was inconvenient. It suggested the Sahara was habitable during a period when it was supposed to be a desert. It implied that early human migration patterns were more complex than the out-of-Africa model allowed. And it opened the door to speculation about lost civilizations, forgotten societies, and suppressed knowledge. That kind of speculation is academic poison. It attracts fringe theorists. It invites public skepticism of established science. And it makes funding agencies nervous, so Schuster's work was quietly shelved. Not debunked, not refuted, just filed away. The same thing happened to the NASA satellite data. When the circles were first identified in 2009, there was brief media coverage, a few articles in science journals, some speculation about ancient forests, and then silence. No follow-up expeditions, no ground-penetrating radar surveys of the identified sites, no large-scale carbon dating projects. The data was acknowledged, catalogued, and ignored, because investigating it properly would require admitting that the standard model was incomplete. And institutions don't admit that lightly. There's also a geopolitical dimension. The Sahara spans multiple countries: Algeria, Libya, Chad, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, Egypt. Each of these governments controls access to the sites where petrified roots have been found, and each has its own reasons for limiting foreign research teams. Some cite security concerns, some prioritize resource extraction over archaeology. Some simply lack the infrastructure to support large-scale scientific projects. But the result is the same. The sites remain unexcavated, the evidence remains buried, and the story remains untold. But the Sahara isn't unique. All over the world there are landscapes that don't match the official history. The Amazon rainforest has geometric earthworks hidden under the canopy, structures that suggest large-scale civilization existed before European contact. The Göbekli Tepe site in Turkey shows advanced construction 11,000 years ago, thousands of years before agriculture was supposed to have developed. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests a cosmic event around 12,800 years ago that reset human development globally. Each of these discoveries challenges the linear model of human progress, and each has been met with resistance, skepticism, and suppression. The pattern is clear. When evidence emerges that suggests human history is older, more complex, or more globally interconnected than the standard model allows, that evidence is marginalized. Not because it's false, because it's destabilizing. It forces a re-evaluation of assumptions, it opens questions that have been considered settled, and it undermines the authority of institutions that have built their reputations on those assumptions. The petrified roots under the Sahara are part of this pattern. They're evidence of a world that existed outside the boundaries of recorded history, a world that was erased not by time, but by catastrophe, a world that supported human life in ways we've forgotten, and a world that, if fully understood, would change how we think about civilization, progress, and the relationship between humans and the environment. So let's put the pieces together. 6,000 years ago, the Sahara was a rainforest. The trees were massive. The ecosystem was rich. And humans lived there, not in cities, not in agrarian settlements, but in mobile, resource-abundant communities that left no permanent structures. Around 5,500 years ago, the North African monsoon shifted, rainfall declined, the forest began to die, and the people who lived there were forced to leave. They migrated east toward the Nile, bringing with them knowledge of ecology, resource management, and complex systems. That knowledge accelerated the development of Egyptian civilization, contributing to the sudden leap in sophistication around 3100 BCE. Meanwhile, the Saharan forest collapsed completely. The trees died, the soil turned to sand, and within a few generations the largest rainforest on Earth became the largest desert. The people who had lived there became refugees, their origins forgotten, and the forest itself became a ghost, visible only as faint circles on satellite images and petrified roots buried 40 feet underground. This narrative doesn't require lost super-civilizations or ancient aliens. It just requires acknowledging that climate can change catastrophically within human lifespans, that ecosystems can collapse completely, and that human societies adapt by moving and integrating rather than building monuments. It's a story about resilience, not mystery. But it's a story that contradicts the idea that civilization is linear, progressive, and concentrated in a few key regions. It suggests that human history is cyclical, that knowledge is gained and lost, and that entire worlds can disappear, leaving only traces. The petrified roots under the Sahara are a warning. They're proof that environments we think of as permanent can vanish, that the Sahara, one of the harshest places on Earth, was once lush and habitable, that the transition from abundance to desolation can happen faster than we imagine, and that when it does, the societies that depend on that environment don't just decline, they disappear. Their knowledge scatters, their achievements are buried, and future generations forget they ever existed. This has implications for today. We live in a world where climate is shifting, where forests are being destroyed at unprecedented rates, where feedback loops are accelerating. The Amazon is losing its ability to generate its own rainfall. The Arctic permafrost is melting, releasing methane. Ocean currents are slowing. These aren't abstract future threats. They're happening now. And if the Sahara teaches us anything, it's that ecosystems don't die slowly. They cross tipping points, and once they do, collapse is rapid, total, and irreversible. But there's another lesson. Human societies are adaptable. When the Saharan forest died, the people didn't. They moved, they integrated, they survived. Their knowledge wasn't lost entirely. It became part of the civilizations they joined. The question is whether we're prepared to do the same, whether we have the social structures, the economic flexibility, and the collective will to adapt when our own environments cross their tipping points. Because if the Sahara is any indication, we won't get a gradual warning. We'll get a collapse. And by the time we realize it's happening, it will be too late to stop it. The roots under the Sahara are still there, wider than stadiums, petrified in circles, waiting under 40 feet of sand for someone to take them seriously. They're not just fossils, they're evidence. Evidence that the world we think we know is built on incomplete information. Evidence that history is deeper and stranger than we've been told. And evidence that the greatest threat to human civilization isn't war, disease, or ignorance. It's forgetting. Forgetting that the ground beneath our feet was once something else. Forgetting that abundance can become desolation. And forgetting that we're not the first society to watch our world collapse and wonder how it happened so fast. The circles are still visible from space. You can see them on Google Earth if you know where to look. Faint outlines in the sand. Echoes of a forest that fed an ecosystem we'll never fully understand. And beneath them, roots as wide as stadiums, silent, petrified, waiting for the story to be told.